The cold air in the execution chamber was still when the young man burst through the double doors. His voice broke the silence that hung between life and death. "Stop it! Don't touch her!" he shouted, his hand trembling with the papers that could change everything. The guards froze, the warden turned, and on the table lay the woman the world once called the Black Widow. Her eyes were calm, almost peaceful, as if she knew this moment would come. The man's breath caught. It had been 25 years since the night she saved his life, and now she needed him to save hers. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa, United States, Canada, UK, Australia, Jamaica. On the quiet edge of Salt Lake City, where the mountains met the desert wind, lived a woman the locals never quite forgave. Her name was Marjorie Vale, though in the whispers that passed through diners and grocery lines, she was known as the Black Widow of Willow Creek. Her husband, Dean Vale, had died mysteriously one winter, found lifeless in his truck on a frozen back road. No one ever proved she did it, but they didn't have to. In a town like Willow Creek, reputation was louder than truth. Marjorie lived alone in a small cedar house that leaned against the slope of a canyon road. The paint had peeled from the siding, the shutters hung loose, and the mailbox had long stopped receiving mail. It had been years since anyone visited. Each morning, she drove her old Ford pickup into town for work, cleaning rooms at a roadside motel, scrubbing floors that would never stay clean. She moved quietly, eyes down, face unreadable. The town looked through her like she was already a ghost. But that winter, something happened that would change everything. It was a night when the snow fell thick and mean, swallowing the streets and silencing the city. Marjorie was heading home from work, her headlights dimming under the storm's weight. That's when she saw them, 3 small figures huddled together on the steps of St. Bridget's Church, barely visible through the curtain of snow. 3 children. A boy no older than 10, another around 7, and a small girl clutching a tattered blanket. Their faces were blue with cold, their shoes soaked through. Marjorie stopped the truck, her heart twisting. She knew what she was about to do would cost her whatever thin thread of peace she still had. People already thought she was cursed, now they'd say she was stealing children too. Still, she carried them home. She wrapped them in quilts, fed them soup, and waited for the sun to rise. When morning came, the storm had buried the town, and her small home smelled of wood smoke and hope. The boy, the oldest, was named Silas, protective and sharp-eyed. The middle child, Eamon, was quieter, clinging to his brother's side. The little girl, Maeve, didn't speak for days. No one knew where they had come from. No one came looking. And so, slowly they became hers. Neighbors began to notice. They saw the children playing in her yard, chasing the old dog that used to bark at everything. They whispered in the aisles of the local market, how strange it was that Marjorie Vale, the widow no one trusted, suddenly had a house full of laughter. The town's gossip stretched faster than truth ever could. "She's doing it for sympathy," some said. "Those kids aren't safe," said others. But the sheriff never came. The county never called. Everyone preferred to watch her from afar, waiting for the curse to return. Through all of it, Marjorie stayed quiet. She mended old clothes for the kids, taught them to cook, and filled their heads with stories of mountain saints and ordinary kindness. She told them that family wasn't always blood, sometimes it was choice. Years later, Silas would remember those words and realize they had saved him more times than he could count. But in those early years, life was hard. Marjorie worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. She took cleaning shifts at night and tended to the motel during the day. Her hands were cracked, her back bent, but her spirit didn't falter. For the first time in decades, her house felt alive again. Still, behind the laughter and the simple meals, a shadow hung over her. She could never fully escape the weight of the town's judgment. At the diner, conversations would stop when she walked in. At church, pews shifted away when she sat down. The nickname Black Widow clung to her like a scar she couldn't scrub off. And yet, despite the cruelty, despite the loneliness, she had something no one could take from her. 3 children who looked at her with love instead of fear. Stories like this one remind us that kindness doesn't always come wrapped in perfection. Sometimes it's rough, misunderstood, and judged by those who never cared to look deeper. If your heart believes that love can come from the most unexpected places, you belong here. Stay with the story. Winter melted into spring. The snow receded, leaving behind muddy roads and new beginnings. The kids began attending the small public school down the road, and for the first time, Marjorie felt like she might have a real chance at peace. But peace in Willow Creek never lasted long. One evening, as she was hanging laundry outside, she noticed a patrol car pull into her driveway. The sheriff stepped out, hat in hand, his face stiff. He wasn't there for small talk. And in that moment, the quiet life Marjorie had fought so hard to build began to tremble under the weight of a truth that had been buried for years. The sheriff, Harlan Pike, had known Marjorie Vale for years. He was one of the few who remembered her before the nickname, before the whispers began. He'd been a deputy when Dean Vale died, and even though there wasn't enough evidence to convict her, the doubt never left his eyes. Now, standing in her yard among the wet laundry and the smell of pine, he looked older, wearier, but no less suspicious. He told her that the county had received a call. 3 missing children, brothers and a sister. They matched the ages of the ones living under her roof. Marjorie didn't flinch. She simply said that no one had come looking. No one had claimed them. She said that children without homes didn't deserve to freeze to death while the world argued about who they belonged to. The sheriff nodded, not disagreeing, but duty was duty. He said he'd have to file a report, make sure everything was in order. His voice was low, almost apologetic. Marjorie understood. She'd lived long enough to know that kindness from the law only lasted as long as paperwork allowed. That night, she couldn't sleep. The children lay close together in the next room, their soft breathing mixing with the whistle of the wind outside. She stared at the ceiling and thought about the choices she'd made, about how sometimes saving someone meant losing yourself a little more each day. Over the next few weeks, people started coming around again. A social worker from the county office. A pastor from St. Bridget's. Even a journalist from the Salt Lake Tribune, hoping to stir up another story about the black widow who couldn't stop collecting strays. The attention reopened old wounds. The town's judgment sharpened again. Neighbors who had begun to soften toward her returned to their cold silence. The grocery clerk stopped making small talk. The woman at the gas station refused her change. But through it all, the children stayed by her side. Silas started helping more around the house, fixing broken boards, chopping wood, protecting her in his quiet way. Eamon began drawing pictures of the house and the mountains, promising that one day he'd build her a better one. And little Maeve, once silent, began to hum old songs Marjorie used to sing while cooking. The sheriff's visits continued. He'd stop by, ask questions, and leave without answers. Each time, Marjorie could feel the rope tightening, not around her neck, but around the life she'd built. Then, one morning, everything changed. A letter arrived. It was postmarked from Ogden, stamped with the seal of the Department of Children's Services. Inside, it said that a family had come forward claiming to be related to the children. They wanted them back. Marjorie stood in her kitchen holding the letter as if it were on fire. The kettle whistled behind her, but she didn't move. She'd always known this day would come. She just didn't know it would hurt this much. For the next few days, she said nothing to the children. She couldn't bring herself to. They noticed her silence, the long pauses between her words, the sadness that filled the space where laughter used to live. Then came the knock on the door. 2 people stood outside, a man and a woman. They looked respectable, well-fed, and nervous. The man introduced himself as Charles Reddick, a relative of the children's late father. The woman said nothing. She just looked past Marjorie into the house, where Silas and Eamon stood watching from the hallway. Marjorie's voice stayed steady, but her hands shook. She asked them to come in, offered them coffee. They declined. Charles explained that they'd lost track of the kids after a family tragedy, an accident, he said, his eyes darting away. They'd searched for them for months before giving up hope. He said they'd like to take them back now, to give them a proper home, a better life. Marjorie wanted to scream that better didn't always mean safer, that love wasn't something you could reclaim like a lost inheritance. But she didn't. She just nodded, staring at the floor, feeling the years she'd spent raising them collapse like dust around her feet. After they left, Silas came to her. He asked if they were going to take him and the others away. Marjorie didn't answer. She couldn't. That night, Silas made a choice. He packed a small bag for himself and the others, took what food he could find, and led his siblings out through the back door. They ran down the dark dirt road, into the woods, toward the mountains. By morning, the house was silent. The beds were empty. Marjorie's heart broke, but she didn't call the sheriff. She didn't report them missing. Because deep down, she understood, sometimes running away was the only way to hold on to love. She sat alone at the kitchen table, the sound of the wind echoing through the empty house. On the table lay a single note, written in Silas's small, uneven handwriting. "We'll come back, Ma. We promise." And with that, the woman everyone called the Black Widow knew that the story the town had told about her was wrong all along. She hadn't cursed anyone. She had simply loved too hard. But what Marjorie didn't know, what no one knew, was that one of those children wouldn't stay hidden for long. Because the sheriff had already found a clue in the woods. A glove. A small, red glove. And it didn't belong to any of the children. 25 years passed. The town of Willow Creek changed, new buildings rose, old names disappeared, and the people who once gossiped about Marjorie Vale grew old or died without ever knowing the full story. But some memories never left. And for one man, they never stopped haunting him. Silas Vale, once a frightened boy rescued from the snow, had grown into a man few people truly knew. He lived in Salt Lake City now, running a small carpentry shop on the edge of town. His hands were scarred from years of labor, but his mind was sharper than ever. He still carried the name Vale, by choice. It wasn't legal, not on paper, but it was the name that had saved him. Every December, Silas drove the long stretch of highway back to Willow Creek. He would park near the edge of the canyon where Marjorie's house once stood. It was gone now, torn down after she'd been arrested 15 years earlier. Yes, arrested. It had started as a small investigation, a journalist digging into the Black Widow's mysterious life after her children disappeared. Rumors spread again. Someone said she'd stolen government checks under false names. Another claimed she'd hidden bodies on her property. It was all lies, half-truths built on small-town poison. But in America, especially in towns like Willow Creek, rumors could carry more weight than proof. By the time Silas found out, she was already behind bars, convicted of financial fraud and obstruction of justice. No one mentioned the decades she spent raising abandoned kids who would have died in that snowstorm. No one mentioned the lives she saved. She'd been sentenced to 25 years, and the newspapers resurrected the name Black Widow like it was her birthright. Now, all these years later, Silas was the only one still fighting for her name. The other two, Eamon and Maeve, had drifted away. Eamon moved to Seattle, changed his last name, started a family. Maeve vanished into the quiet corners of the world, working in hospitals and shelters, trying to repay what she thought she owed. But Silas couldn't move on. He visited the prison when he could. Marjorie would sit across from him in the visitation room, her gray hair pulled back, her hands still trembling from arthritis. And yet, even behind glass and concrete, she looked at peace. She never complained, never cursed anyone for what had happened. All she ever asked was whether the others were happy, whether they were safe. Silas would always lie and say yes. But deep down he knew they weren't, because the guilt of leaving her behind had grown like a shadow that followed each of them everywhere they went. You know, stories like this one remind us that sometimes the people the world throws away are the very ones who carried us when no one else would. If you've ever loved someone who didn't have much but gave you everything, this story is for you. Stay with it. You'll see why. A few weeks before Christmas, Silas received a letter. The handwriting was uneven, but he knew it instantly. It was from Marjorie. The letter was short, just one page, and the words were careful, like someone writing through pain. They want to take me away soon. I don't think I have much time left. Don't be angry, Silas. The truth has its own way of finding daylight. It always does. She didn't sign it, "Love, Marjorie." She never did. She signed it the way she always had. "Yours in kindness, MV." Something in those words shook Silas. He hadn't heard from her in months, and now it sounded like goodbye. He tried calling the prison but got no answers. He called the warden's office, wrote letters, even drove down there himself, only to be told that she'd been transferred. But no one could say to where. When he finally found the truth, it nearly brought him to his knees. Marjorie Vale, the woman the world once called the Black Widow, had been moved to a state penitentiary where inmates with death sentences were held. Silas refused to believe it, but the paperwork said otherwise. Apparently, new evidence had come to light. The same journalists who once hounded her had now linked her late husband's death to her name again, using fragments of old reports and reinterpreted forensics. They wanted a story, and they got one. In a matter of months, her case had been reopened, reclassified, and retried, without real witnesses, without context, without mercy. Now she sat on death row, counting the days. Silas's heart burned with rage and guilt. For 25 years, this woman had been his mother, his savior, his shelter. And now, the world that had always hated her was finally going to finish what it started. He knew what he had to do. He reopened the old files, dug through forgotten case records, and retraced every step of her past. Somewhere in those yellowed pages, he believed the truth was hiding, the proof that could save her. But time was running out. The execution date was already set. And Silas knew that if he didn't find what he was looking for soon, the only woman who ever showed him unconditional love would die condemned for saving 3 children who were never hers to begin with. But as Silas worked late into the night, surrounded by files and fading memories, he found something he wasn't supposed to find. A document, tucked inside an old case folder marked Evidence, Vale Estate, 1988. Inside was a fingerprint record. It wasn't Marjorie's. It belonged to a man who should have been dead. Silas sat alone in his dimly lit workshop, the air heavy with sawdust and silence. The fingerprint record in his hand didn't make sense. It was labeled as belonging to Dean Vale, Marjorie's late husband, but the date stamp told a different story. The prints had been logged 3 years after Dean's death. Silas read it again and again, his pulse quickening. The document was from a hospital in Ogden, signed by a county medical examiner. He cross-referenced the ID number and nearly dropped the paper when the name appeared on the old database. Dean Vale, alias Carl Redmond. Status: released. Witness protection, 1991. The man everyone thought had died in that truck had never died at all. Silas leaned back, stunned. All those years of Marjorie living under the weight of whispers and accusations, all those years of her being called a murderer, had been built on a lie. Dean had faked his death and vanished into a new life, leaving her to bear the blame. For what? He turned the page over, scanning the notes. Then he saw something that froze him, a brief remark from a state investigator. Connection suspected between Redmond and abandoned miners found near St. Bridget's Church, Salt Lake County. Silas's heart pounded as he pieced it together. The 3 children, he, Eamon, and Maeve, hadn't just been abandoned by strangers. They were part of the same story that destroyed Marjorie's life. Dean Vale, or Carl Redmond, had been involved in trafficking stolen identities, using families in crisis to cover his tracks. The children were part of one of those broken families. Their parents had disappeared under circumstances the papers never fully reported. And when Dean vanished, those kids, them, were left behind. Marjorie hadn't just found them by chance that snowy night. She had found the very children her husband had helped destroy. The truth hit Silas like a slow, cold tide. Everything she'd done, every risk she took, had been an act of redemption. She had raised the innocent victims of her husband's crimes, not knowing it at first, and once she did, she'd never told a soul. She'd carried that secret for decades, bearing the town's hatred to protect the only family those children had left. Silas sat at his desk, staring at the evidence, tears stinging his eyes. He realized that every sacrifice, every quiet moment of kindness from her had been her way of atoning for something she never did. He could feel her presence, her steady voice in his memory, saying, "Family isn't what we're born into, it's what we choose to fight for." And now, she needed him to fight for her. The next morning, Silas drove to the state penitentiary. He demanded to speak to the warden, clutching the file like a lifeline. But bureaucracy had no heart. They told him her appeal had been denied. The date for her execution was set, 6 days away. He begged them to review the evidence, to listen, to do something. But no one would listen to a carpenter from Salt Lake. So he made another choice, one he'd been afraid to make for years. He called Eamon. It had been nearly 2 decades since they'd spoken. Eamon had a family now, 2 kids, a good job, a clean life. When he answered, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd buried the past long ago. At first, Eamon refused to get involved. He said the past was too heavy, too painful. But when Silas told him the truth, that their mother was innocent, that she'd gone to prison for saving them, the silence on the line stretched long and deep. Finally, Eamon whispered, "I'll come." They spent days gathering documents, records, and statements. They tracked down old law enforcement officers, journalists, anyone who'd remember the case. And then, a miracle, one surviving witness, an old nurse from Ogden, who had treated a man named Carl Redmond after his accident in 1988. She remembered his scars, his story, his lies. She even remembered him mentioning a woman back home who'd never forgive him if she knew. Her testimony could change everything. But there was one more person who had to be part of it, Maeve. They found her working at a hospital near Reno. When she heard Marjorie's name, she broke down. For years, she'd carried guilt for running away that night, for not looking back. But what Silas told her made that guilt unbearable. Together, the 3 of them, the lost children Marjorie once saved, returned to Salt Lake to fight for her life. As they drove into the city, the snow began to fall again, thick and slow, just like the night she found them 25 years ago. Silas stared out the window, his jaw tight, the file clutched in his hand. They were down to their final hours, and the system didn't care about late discoveries. But he wasn't going to let her die for something she didn't do. The night before the execution, Silas received a call. It was from the warden. He said someone else had come forward, claiming to have information that could stop the execution. But when Silas arrived at the prison the next morning, it wasn't Eamon or Maeve waiting at the gate. It was an older man with hollow eyes, and a name Silas had read only in old files. Carl Redmond. The man standing outside the penitentiary was almost unrecognizable. Age had turned his hair silver and his body frail, but there was no mistaking those sharp, guilt-ridden eyes, the same eyes Silas had seen in every document, every faded photograph. Carl Redmond. The man who had once been Dean Vale. The man whose lies had destroyed Marjorie Vale's life. Silas froze, disbelief crashing over him. Carl looked hollow, like someone who had spent decades trying to outrun his own shadow. In his hand was a worn leather folder, the same kind of folder Silas had used to uncover the truth. He said he had come to make things right, though even he seemed unsure what that meant anymore. Inside that folder were hospital records, photographs, letters, and most painfully of all, a confession. Carl had faked his death 25 years ago to escape prosecution for fraud and identity crimes. He'd used the explosion to vanish, leaving Marjorie as collateral damage. He had planned to return, to tell her everything once he could fix the mess. But he never did. He was too ashamed. When he heard about her sentencing years later, he was already living under a new name, too afraid to come forward. And when he finally built the courage, his health was failing, and the law seemed too complicated to challenge. But when the news broke that her execution was days away, something broke inside him. He couldn't let her die carrying the blame for his sins. Silas followed Carl through the prison gates, his chest heavy with anger and pity tangled together. The staff didn't believe the old man at first, but once Silas showed them the matching fingerprints and hospital logs, things began to move quickly. By afternoon, the governor's office had called for a temporary stay of execution. Marjorie Vale was led from her cell to a small visitation room, unaware of who was waiting. When she saw Carl, alive, older, trembling, her knees buckled. The guards steadied her as she stared at him through tears that refused to fall. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. For 25 years, she had carried his ghost like a cross. And now, the ghost had come back to apologize. Carl confessed everything to the officials, his voice breaking under the weight of it all. He admitted to the fraud, to the staged death, to leaving his wife and the children she'd rescued. He told them Marjorie had no part in any of it, that she had only tried to clean up the wreckage he'd left behind. When the confession ended, he asked for one thing, that they give her back her name before he died. That night, as the news broke, the story swept through Salt Lake City like wildfire. The Black Widow of Canyon Road was innocent. People who once crossed the street to avoid her picture now flooded the prison gates with candles, flowers, and apologies that came 25 years too late. Reporters called it a miracle of truth. But for Silas, Eamon, and Maeve, it wasn't a miracle. It was justice finally done. The governor issued a full pardon. Marjorie walked out of prison the next morning, frail but proud, clutching Silas's hand like she had the night she found him. The snow was falling again, soft, slow, and silent. Eamon and Maeve waited by the gate. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Marjorie looked at them with tired eyes and whispered, "Let's go home." In the months that followed, Carl Redmond passed away quietly in a hospice ward. His written confession became part of a state exhibit on wrongful convictions. And Marjorie Vale, the woman once branded as the Black Widow, began volunteering at a center for abandoned children, the same kind of children she'd once saved. She never spoke ill of the town that had turned on her. She simply said, "Sometimes, the truth takes the long road home." Silas stayed by her side until the end. When she passed years later, he built a small bench overlooking the foothills, engraved with her words. Love doesn't always look like blood. Sometimes it looks like mercy. And every year, on the anniversary of her release, the 3 children, now grown with families of their own, would return to that bench, bringing wildflowers from the old field where she first found them. The world had forgotten her name. But they hadn't, because in their hearts, she would always be more than the woman who saved them. She was the reason they ever knew what family meant. Stories like this remind us that truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way home. If you believe there are still good people in this world, the kind who love without asking for anything back, take a moment to stay with us, to follow the stories that remind hearts like yours why kindness still matters.